Hi, I'm Devlet Taymagambet, and I'm the host of the Principles of Economics course. Today we will talk about trade. In this lecture, we will try to answer the questions like, what exactly do people gain when they trade with one another? Why do people choose to become interdependent? To understand why people choose to depend on goods and services and how this choice improves their lives, let's examine a simple economy. Imagine that there are only two goods in the world, meat and potatoes. And there are only two people in the world, Ruby and Frank. Both Ruby and Frank would like to eat both meat and potatoes. The gains from trade are most obvious if Ruby can produce only meat and Frank can produce only potatoes, so that they can each benefit by specializing in what they do best and then trading with each other. However, the gains from trade are less obvious when one person is better at producing every good. For example, suppose that Ruby is better at producing meat and better at growing potatoes than Frank. In this case, should Ruby choose to remain self-sufficient, or is there still reason for her to trade with Frank? To answer these questions, we need to look more closely at the factors that affect such a decision. Suppose that Ruby and Frank each work 8 hours per day and can devote all time to growing potatoes, producing meat, or a combination of the two. The table above shows the amount of meat and potatoes Ruby and Frank can produce if they devote all 8 hours to producing only that good. So Frank can produce 32 kilos of potatoes or 8 kilos of meat. Ruby can produce 48 kilos of potatoes or 24 kilos of meat. Ruby is more productive in both activities. She can produce more than Frank per day. The table below shows the amount of time each person requires to produce 1 kilo of each good. And again, you can see clearly that Ruby is more productive and spends less time than Frank. The next graph is Frank's production possibilities frontier and shows 3 possible outcomes. First outcome, if Frank devotes all 8 hours of his time to potatoes, he produces 32 kilos, measured on horizontal axis, and no meat. Second outcome, if Frank devotes all of his time to meat, he produces 8 kilos, measured on the vertical axis, and no potatoes. Third outcome, without trade, Frank most probably will choose point A. If Frank divides his time equally between the two activities, spending 4 hours on each, he produces 16 kilos of potatoes and 4 kilos of meat. The next graph shows the production possibilities frontier for Ruby. If Ruby devotes all 8 hours of her time to potatoes, she produces 48 kilos of potatoes and no meat. If she devotes all her time to meat, she produces 24 kilos of meat and no potatoes. At point B, if Ruby divides her time equally, spending 4 hours on each activity, she produces 24 kilos of potatoes and 12 kilos of meat. Once again, the production possibilities frontier shows all the possible outcomes. If Frank and Ruby choose to be self-sufficient rather than trade with each other, then each consumes exactly what he or she produces. That is, without trade, this figure shows the possible combination of meat and potato that Frank and Ruby can each produce and then consume. Now, let's assume that they decide to trade. Ruby suggests Frank to trade and stop producing meat and devote all his time to growing potatoes. If Frank works 8 hours a day growing potatoes, he will produce 32 kilos of potatoes. If then Frank gives Ruby 15 of those 32 kilos, Ruby will give him 5 kilos of meat in return. In the end, Frank will get to consume 17 kilos of potatoes with trade instead of the 16 kilos without trade, and 5 kilos of meat instead of 4. So he gained from trade 1 kilo of extra meat and potato. Now let's see for Ruby. Ruby can produce less potatoes and more meat. She can produce 18 kilos of meat in 6 hours and 12 kilos of potatoes in 2 hours, for example. Then she can trade 5 kilos of meat for 15 kilos of Frank's potato and still end up with more meat and potatoes for consumption. As you can see from this table, both Frank and Ruby will benefit because trade allows each of them to specialize in what they do best. But how do we know who is best at producing these products? Who can produce potatoes at a lower cost? There are two possible answers to that. One way to answer the question about the cost of producing potatoes is to compare the inputs required by the two producers. Economists use the term absolute advantage when comparing the productivity of one person or firm or country to another. The producer that requires a smaller quantity of inputs to produce a good is said to have an absolute advantage in producing that good. In our example, time is the only input, so we can determine absolute advantage by looking at how much time each type of production takes. Ruby has an absolute advantage in producing both meat and potatoes because she requires less time than Frank to produce a unit of either good. Ruby needs to input only 20 minutes to produce 1 kilo of meat, when Frank needs 60 minutes. Similarly, Ruby needs only 10 minutes to produce a kilo of potatoes, when Frank needs 15 minutes. So if we measure cost in terms of the quantity of inputs, Ruby has a lower cost of producing potatoes. There is another way to look at the cost of producing potatoes. Rather than comparing inputs required, we can compare opportunity costs. Remember that the opportunity cost of an item is what we give up to get that item. In our example, we assume that Frank and Ruby each spent 8 hours a day working. Time spent producing potatoes, therefore, takes away from time available for producing meat. When reallocating time between the two goods, Ruby and Frank give up units of one good to produce units of the other, thereby moving along the production possibilities frontier. The opportunity cost measures the trade-off between the two goods that each producer faces. Let's consider Ruby's opportunity cost. According to the table, producing 1 kilo of potatoes takes 10 minutes of work. When Ruby spends those 10 minutes producing potatoes, she spends 10 fewer minutes producing meat. Because Ruby needs 20 minutes to produce 1 kilo of meat, 10 minutes of work would yield half a kilo of meat. So Ruby's opportunity cost of producing 1 kilo of potatoes is half a kilo of meat. Now consider Frank's opportunity cost. Producing 1 kilo of potatoes takes him 15 minutes. Because he needs 60 minutes to produce 1 kilo of meat, 15 kilos of work would yield 1/4 a kilo of meat. So Frank's opportunity cost of 1 kilo of potatoes is 1/4 a kilo of meat. Economists use the term comparative advantage when describing the opportunity cost faced by two producers. In our example, Frank has a lower opportunity cost of producing potatoes than Ruby. 1 kilo of potatoes cost Frank only 1/4 a kilo of meat, but it costs Ruby half a kilo of meat. Conversely, Ruby has a lower opportunity cost of producing meat than Frank. A kilo of meat costs Ruby 2 kilos of potatoes, but it costs Frank 4 kilos of potatoes. So Frank has a comparative advantage in growing potatoes, and Ruby has a comparative advantage in producing meat. Although it is possible for one person to have an absolute advantage in both goods, it is impossible for one person to have a comparative advantage in both goods, because the opportunity cost of one good is the inverse of the opportunity cost of the other. If a person's opportunity cost of one good is relatively high, the opportunity cost of the other good must be relatively low. So, the gains from specialization and trade are based not on absolute advantage, but on comparative advantage. When each person specializes in producing the good for which he or she has a comparative advantage, total production in the economy rises. This increase in the size of the economic pie can be used to make everyone better off. So, in our example, Frank spends more time growing potatoes and Ruby spends more time producing meat. As a result, the total production of potatoes and meat rises. Frank and Ruby share the benefits of this increased production. The story of Ruby and Frank has a simple moral. Trade can benefit everyone in society because it allows people to specialize in activities in which they have a comparative advantage. And that's all for today. Thank you for listening to the third lecture of the Principles of Economics course. And if you have any questions, please send me a message. Good luck and see you soon.